Neocolonialism is the geopolitical practice of using capitalism, business globalization, and cultural imperialism to influence a country, in lieu of either direct military control or indirect political control, that is imperialism and hegemony. In post-colonial studies, the term neocolonialism describes the influence of countries from the developed world in the respective internal affairs of the countries of the developing world. That, despite the decolonisation that occurred in the aftermath of the Second World War, the colonial powers continue to apply existing and past international economic arrangements with their former colony countries, and so maintain colonial control. A neocolonialism critique can include de facto colonialism, and an economic critique of the disproportionate involvement of modern capitalist business in the economy of a developing country, whereby multinational corporations continue to exploit the natural resources of the former colony. That such economic control is inherently neo-colonial, and thus is akin to the imperial and hegemonic varieties of colonialism practiced by the United States and the empires of Great Britain, France, and other European countries, from the 16th to the 20th centuries. The ideology and praxis of neocolonialism are discussed in the works of Jean-Paul Sartre and Noam Chomsky. Term, origins. The political science term neocolonialism became popular usage in reference to the continued European economic and cultural control of African countries that had been decolonized in the aftermath of the Second World War. Kwame Nkrumah, president of Ghana, is believed to have coined the term neocolonialism, which appeared in 1963 preamble of the Organization of African States Charter and was the title of his 1965 book Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism. As a political scientist, Nkrumah theoretically developed and extended, to the post-Euro-war 20th century, the socio-economic and political arguments presented by Lenin in the pamphlet Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. About 19th-century imperialism is the logical extension of geopolitical power to meet the financial investment needs of the political economy of capitalism. In neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism, Kwame Nkrumah writes, in place of colonialism, as the main instrument of imperialism, we have today neocolonialism, which, like colonialism, is an attempt to export the social conflicts of the capitalist countries. The result of neocolonialism is that foreign capital is used for the exploitation rather than for the development of the less developed parts of the world. Investment, under neocolonialism, increases, rather than decreases, the gap between the rich and the poor countries of the world. The struggle against neocolonialism is not aimed at excluding the capital of the developed world from operating in less developed countries. It is aimed at preventing the financial power of the developed countries being used in such a way as to impoverish the less developed. The non-aligned world, neocolonialism became the standard term, describing a type of foreign intervention, because of its practical and historical application to the internal affairs of the countries of the Pan-Africanist movement and because of its usage in the Bandung Conference, from which derived the non-aligned movement. The formal definition of neocolonialism was established by the All-African Peoples Conference and published in the Resolution on Neocolonialism of the organization. At the Tunis Conference and at the Cairo Conference, the AAPC specifically identified as neocolonial behavior the actions of the French Community of Independent States, which was organized by France. Throughout the decades of the Cold War, the countries of the non-aligned movement and the Organization of Solidarity with the People of Asia, Africa and Latin America define neocolonialism as the primary, collective enemy of the economies and cultures of their respective countries. Moreover, neocolonialism was integrated to the national liberation ideologies of Marxist guerrilla armies. During the 1970s, in the Portuguese African colonies of Mozambique and Angola, upon assuming government power, the Liberation Front of Mozambique and the People's Movement for the Liberation of Angola Euro-Labour Party, respectively, established policies to counter neo-colonial agreements with the colonist country. Front Section Afrique, the representative example of European neo-colonialism is Front Section Afrique, the French Africa constituted by the continued close relationships between France and its former African country colonies. In 1955, the initial usage of the French Africa term, by President Far copyright Lix Hufua T. Boigny, of Kati Idva, denoted positive social, cultural, and economic Franco-Euro-African relations. It was later applied by critics of neocolonialism to describe an imbalanced international relation. The term Fraine-section Afrique is derived from the essay La Fraine-section Afrique, La place long scandale de la copyright publique, by Fraine-section Xavier Verschave, which critically analyzed French neo-colonial policies towards the countries of Africa. Moreover, Main Bas sur le Cameroun, Autopsie d'un copyright colonisation, by Mongo Beatty, is a critical history of contemporary Cameroon that reported the continued dependence Euro-economic, social, cultural Euro of decolonised African nations and countries upon metropolitan France, whose dependence was actively continued by the post-independence, national political copyright rights of the given countries. The politician Jacques Foccart, the principal advisor for African matters to the French presidents Charles de Gaulle and Georges Pompidou, was the principal proponent of neo-colonial Fraine-section Afrique. The French Africa works of Verschave and Beatty reported a 40-year, post-independence relationship with the former colonial peoples of France, which feature colonial garrisons in situ and monopolies by French multinational corporations, usually for the exploitation of mineral resources. The African leaders with close ties to France especially during the Russo-Euro-American Cold War it has been argued acted more as agents of French business and geopolitical interests, than as the national leaders of sovereign states. Cited examples are Omar Bongo, Far copyright Lix Hufua T. Boigny, Gnassingbé copyright Yada copyright Ma, Denis Sassou Nguesso, Idriss Dar copyright By, and Hamani Diori. Francophony. The French community and the 75-country Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie have been criticized as agents of French neo-colonial African influence, especially by means of promoting the French language. However, in 1966, the Algerian intellectual Cape Yakin said, "La Francophonie is a neo-colonial political machine, which only perpetuates our alienation, but the usage of the French language does not mean that one is an agent of a foreign power. And I write in French to tell the French that I am not French." A Euro-Cape Yakin biography, Arabesques. Belgian Congo. After a hastened decolonization process of the Belgian Congo, Belgium continued to control, through the socio-copyright tar copyright gar copyright na copyright Rail de Belgique, an estimate of 70% of the Congolese economy following the decolonization process. The most contested part was in the province of Katanga where the Union Minière du Haut-Katanga, part of the socio-copyright tar copyright, had control over the mineral and resource-rich province. After a failed attempt to nationalize the mining industry in the 1960s, it was reopened to foreign investment. Neo-colonial economic dominance. In 1961, regarding the economic mechanism of neo-colonial control, in the speech Cuba, historical exception or vanguard in the anti-colonial struggle. The Cuban revolutionary copyright Guevara said, "We, politely referred to as underdeveloped, in truth, are colonial, semi-colonial or dependent countries. We are countries whose economies have been distorted by imperialism, which has abnormally developed those branches of industry or agriculture needed to complement its complex economy. Underdevelopment, or distorted development, brings a dangerous specialization in raw materials, inherent in which is the threat of hunger for all our peoples. We, the underdeveloped, are also those with the single crop, the single product, the single market. A single product whose uncertain sale depends on a single market imposing and fixing conditions. That is the great formula for imperialist economic domination." A Eurocar copyright Guevara, April 9, 1961. Dependency theory. Dependency theory is the theoretic basis of economic neocolonialism, which proposes that the global economic system comprises wealthy countries at the center, and poor countries at the periphery. Economic neocolonialism extracts the human and the natural resources of a peripheral country to flow to the economies of the wealthy countries at the center of the global economic system. Hence, the poverty of the peripheral countries is the result of how they are integrated in the global economic system. Dependency theory derives from the Marxist analysis of economic inequalities within the world system of economies. Thus, the underdevelopment of the Global South is a direct result of the development in the Global North. The theories of the semi-colony from the late 19th century. The Marxist perspective of the theory of colonial dependency is contrasted with the capitalist economics of the free market, which propose that such poverty is a development stage in the poor country's progress towards full, economic integration to the global economic system. Proponents of dependency theory, such as Venezuelan historian Federico Brito Figueroa, who has investigated the socio-economic basis of neo-colonial dependency, have influenced the thinking of the former president of Venezuela, Hugo Chavez. The Cold War. During the mid to late 20th century, in the course of the Cold War ideological conflict between the US and the USSR, each country and its satellite states accused each other of practicing neo-colonialism in their imperial and hegemonic pursuits. The geopolitical conditions that defined the Russo-Euro-American Cold War led to proxy war, fought by client states in the decolonized countries. Cuba, the Warsaw Pact bloc, Egypt under the leadership of Gamal Abdel Nasser, AL accused the U.S. of sponsoring anti-democratic governments whose raw copyright regimes did not represent the interests of the majority of the populace, and of deposing Third World elected governments who did not subscribe to the geopolitical interests of the U.S., as defined by the East-Euro-West Cold War. In the 1960s, under the leadership of Chairman Mehdi Ben Barka, the Cuban Tricontinental Conference recognized and supported the validity of revolutionary anti-colonialism as a means for colonized peoples of the Third World to achieve their self-determination, which policy angered the US and France. Moreover, Chairman Barka headed the Commission on Neo-colonialism, which dealt with the work to resolve the neo-colonial involvement of colonial powers in decolonized counties, and said that the US, as the leading capitalist country of the world, was, in practice, the principal neo-colonialist political actor. Multinational corporations. Critics of neo-colonialism also argue that investment by multinational corporations enriches few and underdeveloped countries, and causes humanitarian, environmental and ecological devastation to the populations which inhabit the neocolonies whose development and economy is now dependent on foreign markets and large-scale trade agreements. This, it is argued, results in unsustainable development and perpetual underdevelopment. A dependency which cultivates those countries as reservoirs of cheap labor and raw materials, while restricting their access to advanced production techniques to develop their own economies. In some countries, privatization of national resources, while initially leading to immediate large-scale influx of investment capital, is often followed by dramatic increases in the rate of unemployment, poverty, and a decline in per capita income. This is particularly true in the West African nations of Guinea-Bissau, Senegal, and Mauritania, where fishing has historically been central to the local economy. Beginning in 1979, the European Union began brokering fishing rights contracts off the coast of West Africa. This continues to this day. Commercial unsustainable overfishing from foreign corporations has played a significant role in the large-scale unemployment and migration of people across the region. This stands in direct opposition to United Nations Treaty on the Seas, which recognizes the importance of fishing to local communities and insists that government fishing agreements with foreign companies should be targeted at surplus stocks only. The International Monetary Fund. To alleviate some of the effects of neo-colonialism, the American economist Jeffrey Sachs recommended that the entire African debt be dismissed, and recommended that African nations not repay the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. The time has come to end this charade. The debts are unaffordable. If they won't cancel the debts, I would suggest obstruction. You do it, yourselves. Africa should say, thank you very much, but we need this money to meet the needs of children who are dying, right now, so, we will put the debt servicing payments into urgent social investment in health, education, drinking water, the control of AIDS, and other needs, Jeffrey Sachs. Sino-Euro-African relations. Historically, China and Somalia had a strong trading tie. In recent years, the People's Republic of China has built increasingly stronger ties with African nations. China is currently Africa's largest trading partner. As of August 2007, there were an estimated 750,000 Chinese nationals working or living for extended periods in different African countries. China is picking up natural resources petroleum and minerals to fuel the Chinese economy and to finance international business enterprises. In 2006, two-way trade had increased to $50 billion. Not all dealings have involved direct monetary exchanges. In 2007, the governments of China and Democratic Republic of the Congo entered into an agreement whereby Chinese state-owned firms would provide various services in exchange for an equivalent amount of copper ore extracted from Congolese copper mines. According to China's critics, China has offered Sudan support, threatening to use its veto on the UN Security Council to protect Khartoum from sanctions, and has been able to water down every resolution on Darfur in order to protect its interests in Sudan. South Korea's land acquisitions. To ensure a reliable, long-term supply of foodstuffs, the South Korean government and powerful Korean multinational corporations have bought the exploitation rights to millions of hectares of agricultural land in underdeveloped countries of the Third World. South Korea's AG Energy Resources Asset Management CEO Park Yong-soo stressed that the nation does not produce a single drop of crude oil and other key industrial minerals. To power economic growth and support people's livelihoods, we cannot emphasize too much that securing natural resources in foreign countries is a must for our future survival. The head of the Food and Agriculture Organization, Jacques Delors, has warned that the controversial rise in land deals could create a form of neo-colonialism, with poor states producing food for the rich at the expense of their own hungry people. In 2008, the South Korean multinational Daewoo Logistics secured 1.3 million hectares of farmland in Madagascar, half the size of Belgium, to grow maize and crops for biofuels. Roughly half of the country's arable land, as well as rainforests of rich and unique biodiversity, were to be converted into palm and corn monocultures, producing food for export from a country where a third of the population and 50% of children under 5 are malnourished, using workers imported from South Africa instead of locals. Those living on the land were never consulted or informed, despite being dependent on the land for food and income. The controversial deal played a major part in prolonged anti-government protests on the island that resulted in over 100 deaths. Shortly after the Madagascar deal, Tanzania announced that South Korea was in talks to develop 100,000 hectares for food production and processing for $1 billion. Scheduled to be completed in 2010, it will be the largest single piece of agricultural infrastructure South Korea has ever built overseas. In 2009, Hyundai Heavy Industries acquired a majority stake in a company cultivating 10,000 hectares of farmland in the Russian Far East, and a wealthy South Korean provincial government secured 95,000 hectares of farmland in Oriental Mindoro, Central Philippines, to grow corn. The South Iola province became the first provincial government to benefit from a newly created central government fund to develop farmland overseas, receiving a cheap loan of $1.9 million for the Mindoro project. The feedstock is expected to produce 10,000 tons of feed in the first year for South Korea. South Korean multinationals and provincial governments have also purchased land in Sulawesi, Indonesia, Cambodia and Bulgan, Mongolia. The South Korean government itself announced its intention to invest $30 billion in land in Paraguay and Uruguay. Discussions with Laos, Myanmar and Senegal are also currently underway. The South Korean government's strategy is quickly yielding results, and despite predicting that farmland is shrinking on the country, the government announced in August 2009 that South Korea would enjoy a 10% increase in rice production in 2009, the first since 2005, and the government has begun purchasing large quantities of rice to keep prices stable. Other approaches. Although the concept of neo-colonialism was originally developed within a Marxist theoretical framework and is generally employed by the political left, the term neo-colonialism is also used within other theoretical frameworks. Cultural theory, one variant of neo-colonialism theory, critiques the existence of cultural colonialism, the desire of wealthy nations to control other nations' values and perceptions through cultural means, such as media, language, education and religion, ultimately for economic reasons. One element of this is a critique of colonial mentality, which writers have traced well beyond the legacy of 19th-century colonial empires. These critics argue that people, once subject to colonial or imperial rule, latch on to physical and cultural differences between the foreigners and themselves, leading some to associate power and success with the foreigners' ways. This eventually leads to the foreigners' ways being regarded as the better way and being held in a higher esteem than previous indigenous ways. In much the same fashion, and with the same reasoning of betterness, the colonized may over time equate the colonizer's race or ethnicity itself as being responsible for their superiority. Cultural rejections of colonialism, such as the negritude movement, or simply the embracing of seemingly authentic local culture, are then seen in a post-colonial world as a necessary part of the struggle against domination. By the same reasoning, importation or continuation of cultural mores or elements from former colonial powers may be regarded as a form of neo-colonialism. Post-colonialism theory. Post-colonialism theories in philosophy, film, political science, and post-colonial literature deal with the cultural legacy of colonial rule. That is, the cultural identity of the colonized peoples, in which neo-colonialism is the background for the contemporary dilemmas of developing a national identity after colonial rule. Post-colonialism studies how writers articulate, present, and celebrate their post-colonial national identity, which often first must be reclaimed from the colonizer, whilst maintaining strong connections with the colonialist country. How knowledge of the subordinated people was generated, and applied against the colonized people in service to the cultural and economic interests of the colonial country. And how colonialist literature justified colonialism by misrepresenting the colonized people as an inferior race whose society, culture, and economy must be managed for them. Post-colonial studies comprehend subaltern studies of history from below. Post-colonial manifestations of people outside the hegemony. The psychopathology of colonization. And the cinema of filmmakers such as the Cuban Third Cinema, for example Tomás Gushue copywriter R.E.Z. Alia, and the Filipino Kidlat Chimik. Critical theory. While critiques of post-colonialism neo-colonialism are widely practiced in literary theory, also international relations theory has defined post-colonialism as a field of study. While the lasting effects of cultural colonialism are of central interest in cultural critiques of neo-colonialism, their intellectual antecedents are economic theories of neo-colonialism, Marxist dependency theory and mainstream criticism of capitalist neoliberalism. Critical international relations theory frequently references neo-colonialism from Marxist positions as well as postpositivist positions, including postmodernist, post-colonial and feminist approaches, which differ from both realism and liberalism in their epistemological and ontological premises. Conservation and neo-colonialism. There have been other critiques that the modern conservation movement, as taken up by international organizations such as the Worldwide Fund for Nature, has inadvertently set up a neo-colonialist relationship with underdeveloped nations. See also, imperialism, cultural imperialism, academic imperialism, new imperialism, hegemony, cultural hegemony, colonialism, post-colonialism, oil imperialism, ecological imperialism, gatekeeper state concept of neo-colonial successor states, introduced by the African historian Frederick Cooper in Africa since 1940, the past of the present. Neoliberalism, globalization, westernization, Americanization, Sino-African relations, Frana-section was Xavier Verschave's book on Frana-section Afrique, Dependency Theory, Modernization Theory, Washington Consensus, Eco-imperialism, List of coups d'etat copyright at and coup attempts, references. Further reading, Opoku Agyeman. Nkrumah's Ghana and East Africa, Pan-Africanism and African Interstate Relations. Ankel, Guy. Global Communication Without Universal Civilization. INU Societal Research. Volume 1, Coexisting Contemporary Civilizations are Arabo-Muslim, Bharati, Chinese, and Western. Geneva, INU Press. ISBN A2-88155-004-5. Bill Ashcroft, The Post-Colonial Studies Reader. Ialamuwa Borongo, Neocolonialism and African Politics, A Survey of the Impact of Neocolonialism on African Political Behavior. Mongo Beatty, Main Bas sur la Cameroun. Autopsie d'un d'art Copyright Colonisation, New Edition La d'art Copyright Couvert, Paris 2003, A Classical Critique of Neocolonialism. Raymond Marcellin, the French Minister of the Interior at the time, tried to prohibit the book. It could only be published after fierce legal battles. Fra Copyright d'art Copyright Rick Turpin. De Gaulle, Pompidou et l'Afrique, de Copyright Coloniser et Coupe Copyright Rare, Les Savants, Paris, 2010. Grounded on Foucault's previously inaccessible archives, Cum Bevnani. Feminist Futures, Reimagining Women, Culture and Development. C. Mingyan Liz of Rural Mothers, Urban Whores and Working Daughters, Women and the Critique of Neocolonial Development in Taiwan's Nativist Literature, ppA 209-225. David Birmingham. The Decolonisation of Africa. Charles Cantalupo, ed. The World of Ngugi wa Thiong'o. Laura Crisman and Benita Parry, Post-Colonial Theory and Criticism. Renato Constantino. Neocolonial Identity and Counter-Consciousness, Essays on Cultural Decolonization. George A. W. Conway. A Responsible Complicity, Neo-Colonial Power Knowledge and the Work of Foucault, said, Spivak. Julia V. Embley. Thresholds of Difference, Feminist Critique, Native Women's Writings, Post-Colonial Theory. Nikolai Alexandrovich Ermolov. Trojan Horse of Neocolonialism, U.S. Policy of Training Specialists for Developing Countries. Thomas Gladwin. Slaves of the White Myth, The Psychology of Neocolonialism. Lewis Gordon. Her Majesty's Other Children, Sketches of Racism from a Neocolonial Age. Enki M. Halojvelt. Globalization and the Post-Colonial World, The New Political Economy of Development. J. M. Hobson, The Eastern Origins of Western Civilization, M. B. Hooker. Legal Pluralism. An Introduction to Colonial and Neo-Colonial Laws. E. M. Kramer, The Emerging Monoculture, Assimilation and the Model Minority. C. R. Kerner J. Batts, Asian Indians and the Model Minority Narrative, A Neo-Colonial System, ppA 203-221. Goulundstad, The Fall of Great Powers, Peace, Stability, and Legitimacy. Jean-Paul Sartre. Colonialism and Neo-colonialism. Translated by Steve Brewer, Azadin Hadar, Terry McWilliams, republished in the 2001 edition by Routledge, France. ISBN 0-415-19145-9. Pechsia, T. 2014, The Theory of the Globe Scrambled by Social Networks, A New Sphere of Influence 2.0, Dirigentium, Rivista di Filosofia del Diritto Internazionale della Politica Globale, Sesi in l'Afghanistan Contemporaneo, http, www.Eurogentium.org/htm, Stuart J. C. Bora. U.S. Neocolonialism in Africa, D. Simon. Cities, Capital and Development, African Cities and the World Economy. Philip Singer, ed. Traditional Healing, New Science or New Colonialism. Jean Shurat Knail. Essays on African History, From the Slave Trade to Neocolonialism. Ga Copyright wa Thiong'o. Barrel of a Pen, Resistance to Repression in Neo-Colonial Kenya. Carlos Alzugaray II. El Ocaso de Unra Copyright Jaiman Neocolonial, Estados Unidos y la Dictadura de Batista durante 1958, The Twilight of a Neocolonial Regime, the United States and Batista during 1958, in Temas, Cultura, Ideología y Sociedad, No. 16-17, October 1998/March 1999, ppA 29/41. United Nations. Reports of International Arbitral Awards. XXVII United Nations publication. PA 188. ISBN A978-92-1-033098-5. Richard Webner Post-colonial identities in Africa. External links: China, Africa, and Oil. Becky Warnes on China-Africa ties, Neocolonialism in Encyclopedia of Marxism. Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, by Kwame Nkrumah, originally published 1965. Comments by Professor Jeffrey Sachs, BBC, Harvard economist Jeffrey Sachs video, hosted by Columbia University. The Myth of Neocolonialism by Tund Obadina, Director of Africa Business Information Services, http www.africahistory.net/. Inf.htm Market Reform and Corporate Globalization, by Dr. Gloria Migwoli, Prof of History and African Studies, Con. State University. Academic Course Materials, Sovereignty in the Post-Colonial African State, Syllabus at Joseph Hill, University of Rochester, 2008. Studying African Development History, Study Guides, Lori Saitinen, Par-Currency Iviasu, Wolfgang Zeller. Helsinki University, 2007.